And good morning, everybody. Welcome to a new edition of Right Aligned. Sorry for the slight delay. Lily had a massive malfunction at the studio and kindly rushed back home to join us after a quick Uber, which is great to have you with us, Lily. Traditionally, what we like to do with these sessions is ask our guests to take us back as far as
that. I will. I'm going to come and join the.
Just mute a few people. Yeah, as far as I'd like to, if that's okay, Lily. Just whether it's through early years inspiration, whether that's university, and then through early stage career roles, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course. Hi, everybody, and thanks, Chris, for having me on here. It's a great opportunity to kind of dig into and actually kind of reflect on how I've got to where I am today, which is kind of like a funny kind of moment in time to actually kind of take that time and think about these things. Because when you actually when I started to look back this morning, I was like, oh, what was the kind of basis that kind of landed me here? It's always been this kind of fascination in people. So even when I was at school, I was like the people watcher who was kind of hanging out with loads of different groups, kind of like interested in what makes people tick. And then when I went to university, I have an older sister, gratefully, who was like, university means very little, do something that you're interested in. And so I ended up doing an anthropology based course that got to again kind of like understand what makes people tick, and also kind of did history as well to understand how people kind of move through and kind of what systems have been created over I did modern history, so over the past 200 years that have formed our lives. And then fast forward into kind of like young me trying to get into the workforce, worked in a call center like most good people have, and ended up working in agencies, small, large agencies, on the producing and account management side, learning how to kind of really listen to clients, how to kind of, I guess it's almost kind of the basis of learning kind of strategy. How do you kind of listen to what people are really saying and what in between what they're saying? How do you kind of sell ideas or kind of have a way to communicate them in a way which is kind of really compelling for them and where they're at? And yeah, so over the last kind of like 10-year period, I went through working as a brand manager at Getty Images to working for Dazed, for them when they're setting up the kind of Dazed media kind of agency part and thinking about how publishing could be used as editorial voices for brands. And then joined A&P nearly 6 years ago now, initially as a commercial strategist, so thinking about working on the business, how the business is showing up, and then moving into more creative strategy, so how the agency is showing up, but for our clients as well as for ourselves.
Wow, that's amazing. Do you think that there's that not doing maybe traditional creative education, that curiosity is what sort of ultimately leads you towards being a strategist? Is it sort of wanting to know a lot about the world, about people, and that ultimately forms the foundation that you need to be able to then, it's not just about the visual sort of side, is it, or the creative necessarily. It's about that bigger picture that it's all formed on.
Yeah, I mean, curiosity is such an important word, and it comes up so often in strategy that you have to have a curiosity to go beyond the questions or the spaces that people would normally go into. Some places are quite uncomfortable what you need to ask or what you uncover as you're holding up a mirror to people. But I think that ultimately, what I've learned is that, as with a lot of things, as with design, a lot of kind of different kind of creative skill sets, that a lot of it's about the ability to communicate and tell the story behind your idea or behind the reason of your insight or what you've uncovered and why that's powerful, and be able to talk about it in a way that hasn't been heard before, so it really connects. And so there is the curiosity as part of the rhythm of kind of digging deep and understanding, and then there's the kind of need to be able to write and tell your ideas in new and interesting ways, for both like for clients, but also because strategy is like a merged discipline, right? We work kind of cross-discipline with the creative team, with our producers to create the project.
Yeah, and it was something that was never really spoken or mentioned much when I started out. I think we were all doing it, but we didn't have a word for it, and we didn't sort of have teams for it. Everybody sort of just chipped in. Now, how does that work for you at A&P? you involved in the process with the client initially, you know, those briefing stages, and you start to form the strategy, and then you pass it to the creative? Is it a bit more, is it a bit a closer way of working at AMP?
Yeah, I mean, gratefully, I think because we formed what strategy means at AMP, it allowed us to kind of almost break some of the rules that are in existence, which is that strategy is this like mystical thing that sits over there that people don't really understand or 100% know how to use it, or even how to talk about it and sell it, let's be honest. And so we were able to think about that from the start, that actually strategies there upfront, new business, having conversations, kind of finding insights that are kind of really compelling and interesting that might kind of help our clients think differently, or areas they might need to push into, but also how our kind of like design team or the other part of the creative team, seen as like one big team, kind of work together right from the beginning of a project. So that's from, you know, we get our kind of immersion sessions in just like everybody else, and then how are we moving into more of a co-creation space where as the agency are showing up as both kind of like strategic thinking and creative thinking together, so we can kind of like create more of a kind of a superpower, rather than just kind of leaving it on one department to kind of like answer to the brief, to kind of like start to uncover the problems. Actually, let's co-own that, let's find those together.
How do you, without revealing secrets or things that you've built up over time, how do you find those insights that set you apart from somebody else? Is that just the team that's been built at AMP that just, you know, it's just that bit more unique than another, or is there something specific?
I would say yes to that, Chris, of course. Like well, I mean, the agency is made up of its people, right? And our people are gratefully incredible thinkers. And I think the other thing that we're kind of almost touching on is that people have always been placed in silos, right? You're in the design team, you sit over here. You're a producer, you sit over here. You're in strategy, you sit over there. But we're not actually thinking about ourselves as holistic people with multiple talents. You know, that we think that just because you have the role of a junior designer kind of doesn't mean that you're not going to hit the ultimate insight that is going to form what the project is. I think there's just an openness and a movement away from the natural hierarchy, which means that only the lead strategist can come up with the insight that's going to inform everything else. It's actually that what you need is lots of people with different ways of seeing, because the world isn't binary. There's loads of different ways to look at the world and understand it. And sitting as somebody in my late 30s, I'm not going to understand everything that's coming out as emergent culture. And so need to connect with people who do, and really respect that people have their kind of knowledge base.
That's been a fascinating thing that I've heard through a lot of these events this year specifically, is the idea of a much more equal democratic approach to studio life now. It seems really refreshing that, you know, that you can have, it must be so empowering for younger people to feel that they can speak out, because it's quite, you're putting yourself on the line, aren't you? You're sharing your ideas and you're sharing your thoughts and stuff. So then the fear, I remember going back to when I started out, that fear, you've made you sort of not want to say anything because of, you know, of what might get said back. But to have that, to know that you're going into an environment that embraces that, that must be sort of, you know, from all levels, you know, from different ages, experience levels, yeah, to just every part of that process must just feel so inspiring to the people that are within it.
Yeah, I really hope so, because I'm inspired by all the people who feed into it too. And so it's kind of like this sense of shared appreciation. I think also what we've seen, and I'm sure lots of other studios have seen this too, but in the last 2 years, since we've been working remotely, we're just about to move back to a hybrid model. But since we've been working remotely, that actually those voices have had to get louder, because you can't sit back at the back of the kind of crit wall or the share or whatever. You want to be really speaking to your work and having more ownership of it. So I think that's one of the positive things that have kind of like grown in the last couple of years.
Yeah, and from what I was saying before we came on, I've done the reverse of, I've gone to like the here and now, which I sort of skipped your early part. I'm really fascinated into people's the start of their transitioning from education to industry. And how was that for you? Did you go straight to Getty, did you say? Was that?
No, I didn't, mate. Had a little wobbly path. I went to Australia for a bit, living my best life. I worked in the financial district in marketing. I then worked for, I wanted to completely save the world, which we'll get on with A&P. But so I worked for a charity that was working with long-term probation and people coming out of serving time to get them rehabilitated. I worked with social services for people with complex needs. And so I've had a real kind of mixed background. I mean, I worked in the fruit packing factory when I was 14. So like everything kind of like forms part of the way that you understand and see and know the world, which is so important for the briefs that we get through, is that you have this kind of diversity of experience, I think, rather than maybe just a singular line.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, really important for people to hear, because again, it's something that's very frequently overlooked, I think, in this industry. You know, it's leave university and become, you know, the creative director of Pentagram or something, and sort of forget the 40 years in the middle where you go through the ups and the downs and the highs and the lows. I think it's so important for people to hear that stuff, because we all do it, but if you don't know, if you can't relate to people, then you sometimes feel like you're on the outside of it, or you're failing quickly. Those earlier roles then, was there a turning point why you then pivoted towards strategy? Was that a conscious decision? Was that just an opening arrived, opening was made available, or was it something deeper than that?
I was always a frustrated creative. I was like at school just not very good at graphic design, went for my art GCSE being like, I'm going to smash this. It did not turn out how it was in my head. And so I realized that actually the application part of it isn't my jam. I have sketches and sketches in my notebook, which will easily prove that really is not my jam. But the thinking about, the ideating, the seeing things from lots of different perspectives, and being able to kind of dive into what's happening in culture, where are we trying to form this, what conversations are we trying to have, how are we going to move, shift this forward. That is where I started to just understand, even from when I was producing and kind of working with clients, forming out what the brief could be. I started to see these themes come up, and I had an incredible mentor. I would suggest everybody gets a mentor. Mine was by accident. I didn't go searching for her. She became my boss when I was at Getty Images, and she was just like a light in my life who helped me kind of uncover that your role is not who you are. Your role is like something you're transitioning through to maybe get to somewhere else, or to learn more, or to grow more, but it doesn't have to define what your skill set is. You're more than that.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. It's again, I've been talking to people recently about, I used to do it myself, but you lead with the idea of what you do. When it's sort of, you're just containing yourself in a very small sort of little box, when you sort of talk about your why and your purpose and stuff like that, it's so much stronger. It's a fascinating, I think that's a completely different session, which could be really interesting to talk about. Is that, when we first spoke a while back, and what you just mentioned then through that list of things you did in your early days, was that idea of saving the world, changing the planet, using design for good, some of the things that are now commonly sort of spoke about, is that something that drives you individually as well as what you do at A&P? Yeah,
definitely. I think more so since having a kid, to be honest, Chris, I think you see the world afresh that way. You kind of almost, there's this acceptance that it is what it is, and you know what, I've probably got a good, hopefully 50 to 60 years left on this planet, and then I'm out of here. And then suddenly like, oh wow, no, there is this whole other generation coming up, and we have seen this kind of destroying this kind of, again, this divorce of our self-impact on the planet and what it means for the people who we're giving it to them to solve, and how we actually need to be moving through the world with so much more grace, so much more connection with each other and community. I think saving the planet is definitely kind of one of those big things that's had its kind of real focus, and us as an agency really believe that we are here to help kind of create those solves, to be part of that journey of moving design for good. But I see that also connected with the work that I kind of do in terms of strategy, and also I'm a coach and I work with people to connect themselves in community too. I think that isolation often creates this rejection of of how we can show up for each other and show up for our planet. And so I think there's it's so multi-layered, and I think that that for me, the working with people and getting people to feel connected to the earth again is kind of part of why I show up to work every day, and part of what I choose to do in my off time as well.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, in terms of that we sometimes look at the big picture when it's quite hard to make an impact on that massive sort of, on the whole world, so to speak. But the idea is sometimes we forget the communities that we're in and we're part of, because they're just always there, aren't they? But we don't necessarily always pay much attention to them, and they need to be nurtured probably more. If we do that individually across the world, they sort of do improve the whole place, don't we? So is that something that you proactively do, work with people within your community, or AMPs as a whole, sort of, focus on where you're at, the environment you're in, and the those communities that you inhabit?
Yeah, definitely both, actually, Chris. So from an AMP point of view, just like talking hyper local, I found that David, his children go to a school really close to the studio, and he just identified that there was all these cars idling around outside the school, and the pollution rates in Hackney, where we're based, are just like awful. And when you've learned all these stats that actually 72% of our school classrooms across the capital have more pollution than on some of the major roads, and because it gets captured in there. And so you think about these kind of like what we're saying about this future generation who are coming up, we want to create the environment for them to live and thrive. We know that chemically and kind of like scientifically, that being surrounded by that level of pollution not only impacts cognition, but impacts growth and kind of like the physical growth, but also kind of mental cognition pieces. And so we created a campaign which was all about kind of kill your engine. So when you're in the vicinity or anywhere really, stop idling your car. An idling car actually emits more pollution than a car driving a mile down the road, just in the way that engines work, which I do not understand and will not even pretend to. But and so we created this hyperlocal campaign for the schools of Hackney, and then we realized that obviously this is a global issue, opened that out as a global platform that you can go on to killyourengine.com, and maybe someone could drop the link in the chat if anybody's from AMP, and you can go on and kind of build out your own posters and do kind of fly postering campaigns, and also give yourself material to be able to knock on that car window and have something and be armed with something, which hopefully in a non-aggy way tells people that actually, this is maybe the best thing to do right now around the school for the environment of our young people.
You wouldn't do that around my daughter's school, but
Yeah.
So those sort of self-initiated projects, is that something that, I know there's a lot of studios do that, but obviously it's not something that's always promoted, because it's done for, it's a non-profit cause, it's done for, for the greater good. Is that something that you guys are quite big on?
Yeah, we do see that as a kind of a really important grounding of our work. I think that ultimately we partner with lots of different amazing kind of businesses and brands who are looking to create change, and we're kind of part of that facilitation. But also there's just sharp points that you just want to really kind of delve into yourself. And so, yeah, we run personal projects. We've worked with Extinction Rebellion, and obviously it can be quite polarizing with some of the people that we work with, but it's a belief system that we do need to be actively and relatively loudly having a voice out in the street. And, when there is an XR kind of gathering or a happening, should I say, that as a studio we're open to take part and be involved, and kind of leave our desks and physically show up, as well as show up with our skills.
Yeah, and I've noticed that with some of the articles that I've seen you guys produce, it's not like, what I really find fascinating about that, it's not not trying to sell the studio, for instance. It's more about an education or something that everybody can be involved in, or just about different viewpoints. I think there was something published, I'm not sure if David did it, but it was about, it's not just about creating great work anymore. There needs to be so much more than that with It's Nice That. Again, is that something that the whole team are involved in, and you get asked or requested to get involved in because of it's becoming public knowledge that that's part of your ethos?
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, that was an article written about us, and gratefully we were able to be featured in it as a agency who's creating change. And really recently we went to on a company-wide retreat, actually at the end of January, I think it was, went up to Yorkshire. I walked barefoot through the forest. It was freezing. I do not recommend it, but we spent time together, and again, like back to like our community, us as like a little agency community, understanding, you know, what are our passions, how do we want to kind of like work for designing for good, what does that mean to us, and what does that mean to us as an agency, and how's that going to show up in our work, in what we do as kind of personal projects, and how we're going to show up for each other while we're doing it. So we also spend a lot of time kind of listening to everybody's point of view. These can't just be just let out. These really need to feel like everybody has a point of view that and a passion that could create change.
And do you go through phases where you ever think you got to be careful about how you approach that sort of stuff, especially when it goes out to the public? Because, you know, the sort of cynical world that we live in, as well as the, you know, proactive wanting to make change. Is there ever any concern from that perspective, or is it just always feels right internally, and that's all you need really to justify it to yourselves?
Gratefully we're independent, so there aren't as many checks and balances in that kind of world, unlike kind of speaking to some of my peers across different agencies who have to be very monitored. There's even like discussion guides, comms guides, who can you talk to, what are you sharing. That corporate world does not gratefully exist at AMP, so yes, there's very much like a freedom of speech element to it. But I think that what I've seen, kind of like reversing back again into working with brands, is that a lot of people have really good and established ethics and belief systems around what sustainability means to them and what they want to do. But they feel so concerned and embroiled in this world of, I don't want to say it because I'm going to be seen as greenwashing. You're going to be able to pick out this one thing that I did 10 years ago that doesn't speak to my ethics now, and terrified of cancel culture and being pulled across the coals. Whereas I believe we need to be actively having these conversations. This is what we need to do. This is kind of part of it. We are all complex. We all have positive and negative. It's a full yin and yang constantly. And what we need to do is be iteratively moving towards the positive. Nobody can like completely switch over, well, unless you're kind of built today. Maybe if you launch today in this new world, you'll be appropriate for today for this new world, but that's not the same for a lot of brands and agencies.
I couldn't agree more. I think the more open and honest conversations people have, whether it's opinions you agree with or not, it's better than not having it at all, isn't it? So it's it's definitely must be had. We were, as you were hot footing it here in your cap, we were talking about the AMP of tomorrow slightly, and the rebuild of the site. Can you go into a bit more detail about that? And is there a shift in maybe the vision, or is it just your evolving nature as a studio?
Yeah, we have evolved. Obviously, as a studio, as a lot of studios have, we are 15 years old now. We've just welcomed our first MD, Sally, who's joining us to help kind of build up our strength. We are kind of always thinking, as like a lot of agencies are and kind of creative people, of what stories are we telling out into the world and how we're telling them. And one of the obvious places that kind of lives is on our site, even though we give so much love to our kind of like social channels and the kind of how we can serve people really kind of interesting, insightful kind of thinking and content quickly. But yes, you're right, we are working on our site. It is I would say it's a passion project, but I wouldn't want to speak to the passion of the people who've been working on it for a minute. But because these internal projects can become quite large. But what you'll see when we launch our site is, yes, absolutely, it's interweaving a lot of our kind of thinking, our purpose, what we're here to do in the world, alongside sharing kind of like the best of our co-creation, client work, and also our personal projects, and really kind of giving them a bit more of a voice.
Yeah, sounds amazing. So going to more of a sort of honing in specifically on projects, is there a sort of process that the reason I asked this question is that we have started to run a new series of events alongside these in conversation type pieces, where we're asking certain studios to walk us through a typical sort of process, and I know that varies. It's very rarely going to be the same across the board, but it's been a really fascinating insight just to sort of see that that very specific thing that they have built, a way of doing it, the methods, and that structure. Do you have that at AMP, a sort of a bit of off the shelf sort of approach that you have built over time that you then follow with each client, or do you work in a very unique way per brief?
So I think we have obviously our kind of gold standard process, which is something that, as you say, we've tried and tested over kind of like, and it iterates. Like, this is not something that we kind of like plug and play every time. But you're right. Every time that we work with a new client or a new brief, we really consider actually how should we be approaching this? How can we make sure that this is going to land in the best possible space? And that does mean flexing our process. So we tend to start, as like a lot of people do, with the cadence of that kind of immersion, kind of going to that discovery phase. It's that almost like completely kind of losing yourself in all the learning, so you can unlearn what you thought before, because a lot of times we approach projects, especially with kind of big brands, with perception, and we need to kind of divorce ourselves of those so we can understand from the audience point of view who they are, how they are, what they're showing up, what their kind of issues are, what they're seeing. And we do that from kind of lots of different ways. You know, obviously it's desk research, audit, there's qualitative research, there's talking to people in brand, there's talking to people who don't know them at all, and just kind of understanding what's going on in culture wider than where they're showing up. And as I kind of touched on right at the start, that isn't just a strategic or a project management based kind of starting point. That's where we really kind of start as a creative team. So I think from all the studios that I've worked in, A&P have really thought about how we can merge kind of that creative learning and kind of like unlocking people's kind of different strengths from the very beginning of our project, so that we're not kind of getting to a spot that is just being led by one voice or kind of becomes very monotoned. And we go through the kind of more kind of design and iteration space that I'm sure you kind of have moved through too, Chris. Do you have a kind of locked in process?
I try to. It very rarely sticks to what it says. But there's so many variables out there. It's I think having that foundation that most things are hooked onto is really important internally. But you have to have that flexibility to work with the people. And it's not just the creative side of it, is it? It's just that those initial conversations and how people work, getting to build new relationships if it's a fresh, you know, it just takes time. And I think that's something that's really important for especially people that may be just starting their journey. That's if you have the luxury of working in agencies that do have these processes in place, that there is a huge amount of time, isn't there, before you ever even get to the creative. Is that something that you guys, you know, you involve the client, you know, each people that are, you know, the actual business itself, and then internally, that a real big part of the process for you guys?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to use the word partnership because it's one of those awful words that like purpose, so it's like almost has been so overused that it's kind of like disappeared in its meaning in any way. So we kind of talk about co-creation quite a lot, but really we're talking about partnership. We're just having to relabel. So yeah, absolutely, because the client is the expert in whatever they whatever kind of like brief they're bringing to you. They are so imbued with that knowledge and with the knowledge of where they've been before. Maybe they were at the fruit packing factory, maybe they were kind of like doing like bizarre jobs that kind of led them with their kind of mongrel experience to where they are today. And that is great. Like, believe in the richness of individuals and what they're bringing, and don't have this kind of, and I think this is quite old school now. I don't see this showing up in a lot of agencies, but that kind of traditional, when I was starting out, there was almost like this austere approach. We are the agency, you're most welcome. Will grace you with our presence and come with you with ultimate insight. And thankfully, over too many years that I do not want to mention, Chris, that has been dismantled. And now it's kind of, we're in a space of kind of mutual respect and understanding.
Yeah, I think that ultimately, that breaking those barriers and breaking those sort of traditional methods down is really, I think it's really quite obvious to see that in most of the work that now gets produced, isn't it? There's much more of an honesty to a lot of it, you know. And I think you can see it in different types of work. Before I seem to remember quite a standard type way of designing previously, and now it seems to be individual teams like you guys and many others are creating their own little families that are all just buying into they're finding people that buy into that ethos or principle, and that can only lead to a better place in the future. I think it's that like you say, that old austere sort of type approach it didn't do anybody any good, really, did it? It was quite a negative when you look back on it in terms of where it put everything and where it put everybody, especially that relationship between creators and clients. It was, you're lucky to be working with us sort of type mentality,
Yeah.
Come and visit our swanky studio, and it was a day out sort of type thing, as opposed to people learning off one another and sharing experiences and buying into each other's values. When I look back through some of the work building up to this of you guys, I had a sort of sense of quite scientific and very, it was beyond design in some ways. That sounds very strange thing to say, but it just had this real depth. I think it was more, I was looking at some of the animated Nike work, especially on the socials. How does that, I don't even know how you even start to create that. And that's why I think I like it so much, because I just sort of think, yeah, that's just way better than anything I could never come up with. But it wasn't a case of sort of saying that it's better than somebody else or better than me, etc., etc. It was more a case of, like, wow, where did that come from? And that's sort of, how do you go about building something like that?
So we started, one of our first and longest running personal projects was called the Light Calendars. And for 10 years, we tracked kind of day and night. Fundamentally, we kind of created these beautiful reinterpretations of how kind of when the sun rises and sets. So what we're talking about is really beautiful data visualizations, fundamentally, that actually have an artful purpose. And it really is those kind of slightly deeper stories. You look at it once, you get a singular read, that it's this kind of beautiful kind of like, often they're kind of these circular moments. We see the horizon line and worth having a look at, and we're doing a sale for Ukraine, so please have a look. But what you start to understand is actually these are multiple layered, and what you're touching on with the Nike work and a lot of the work that gratefully we kind of gets magnetized towards us is the work that needs to be imbued with more of a story or more of a truth than just something with pure aesthetic value. Because for us too, like, we want to be able to tell stories in everything we do. We want to uncover kind of new meanings or understand new ways of even how we show up, how that kind of animation kind of plays out, so that we are also constantly iterating and improving and innovating. And some of that is done through this kind of very kind of almost scientific kind of forensic, I would like to say, like almost kind of a forensic point of view of how you construct something so it feels different and it feels new.
Yeah, well, it definitely had that sort of sense of, it was so multi-layered and not just that one project. I mean, that did stand out in terms of because of the length of the animation, whether it's more of a video clip, but it did give that sort of sense of research strategy within the creative process. It allowed you to sort of, in some way, I felt like I was walking through the stages that you guys have probably been through yourselves, but it was all encased in the creative that was delivered to the consumer or the audience at the time. I think it's just a real fascinating way of doing it and looking at that as opposed to just being a piece of branding or a singular project. It allowed me to feel like I could walk through the mindset of the studio, which is a real nice way of sort of viewing it, really. As we're moving towards the end of it's fascinating to sort of think where you think A&P is sort of heading in the short and long term, and what the sort of look of the studio and the work might be.
Yeah, I think that in the short term, we are coming back together as a agency community from next month. So that's going to be a great kind of refresh for us to get together and work on everything we spoke about earlier, those personal projects, what we're working through in our labs, what are we kind of really investing ourselves in kind of beyond our client work, and making sure that we're kind of doing that in a really kind of supportive and wholesome way. There's a lot of what we do as an agency that I think you see in our work but isn't ever told, which is how we kind of create this environment where you can kind of learn and grow and really show up as your whole self, not just kind of an element. So that's kind of like in the really short term, is just kind of being there to continue the great work that we're doing. As we're moving into kind of medium long term, as a studio, we have kind of like, as mentioned, we recently went to our retreat in Broughton Hall where we were agreeing what the future focus of the studio is. We've been working on something called our Living Business Plan, which was running in beta last year, which is a way that we run our business, which isn't by a traditional business plan method. It's a whole session in its own right, Chris, but it's kind of understanding that businesses aren't their one-line revenue. Businesses are so much more than that, and how they show up and what they can do and what their power is immense if it is done with intention and if we kind of move forward and into it. So we've been working on that as a studio, which is going to dictate some of the work that we kind of continue to do over the next kind of couple of years, working within our kind of manifesto and our point of view that we want to really just kind of poke at things so we can move forward and really kind of create those waves of change, partnering with our clients to understand it, uncovering those powers, but also doing it for ourselves, and really kind of ensuring that the way that we're showing up is representative of the future world that we want to create. I think and I cannot remember who this quote is by, so it's really awful. So I'm just going to say it's by me today, but it is that the future is created by the minds of the people today. So it's in our imagination, whatever the future will be, and we have the power to be able to form that and change that, depending on what we're working on and what we're thinking about right now.
Yeah, and I think that's fascinating, isn't it? The idea that a creative business can be more than just serving a client or a niche or a sector. That I think the rise in people doing things like what we're doing with this and podcasts and stores are bolted onto websites and other ventures, but how that can then be pushed to the next sort of level in the future. That's really fascinating to see where that could go, because I think what we do for clients could be very, very beneficial for many other sort of, whether that's communities or not-for-profits or other sort of areas of the world. I think we can use the skills that we've got and the sort of the processes that we use to really benefit a lot of people, isn't it? As opposed to just paying clients. So it'd be interesting to see where that goes. Just to finish up, Billy, this is a little bit an open question, really, but where do you think the industry's at now, and where do you think it could go in future that can help some of those issues that you've talked about today? In terms of working towards a bit of a better future, or leaving the planet in a better state than what we found it.
I think it's in, and it has been for a moment, so I'm not going to say this is brand new, Chris, but it's having a bit of a self-reckoning, because beyond the fact that the outside world is calling for this and everything that we know is happening in the world that is kind of external, but also because the people who are showing up and graduating and moving through and being these kind of incredible, inspirational people who are moving into creative world want more. Like, they want more than just showing up, kind of like sitting at a desk and churning through work. They want to be bringing their whole self to it in a completely new way than we've seen before. So beyond it being kind of like needed by the world, it's also you kind of got this push and this pull that it is going to change, because ultimately, kind of like gratefully, the generations that are following up behind us are expecting and are pushing at the boundaries of what it means to be creative.
Yeah, and that can only be beneficial in the long term, can't it? In terms of, say, you're just a designer and you apply for every design job going in your area, you now sort of have the opportunity to find people that are very like-minded, allow you to do that. Your personality is just as equal as your portfolio, if not more. Relevant, isn't it? And that can only be exciting for the future of design and creative industries, can't it?
Agreed.
So, yeah. That sounds a great place, very positive place to leave it. It's always good to sort of look towards the future, even though it's difficult to know how to nail that one down. But I appreciate your time, Lily. I appreciate you running back home as quickly as possible after the blackout. And we'll definitely have to catch up in future and look at those other subjects that you mentioned there in more depth. But I think David and Jesslyn have dropped in those links into the chat if anybody wants to quickly grab those. But I hope you have a great rest of the day and weekend ahead. And we'll speak again very soon.
Nice one. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everybody.
Take care. Thank you. Speak to you soon.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.